Evil Geniuses have officially announced the departure of both Nameless and Enable in order to pick up both Silly from United and Assault from Echo Fox. Immediately when this team formed, the major kind of topic being brought about were expectations. Heading into World War II, this team had a spotlight on themselves pretty much similar to Luminosity Gaming. I mean, just the hype around this team, the level of accomplishments that they've had in the past. The major thing was, from the community, in my own opinion as well, is can they put aside the egos? Can they put aside the accomplishments, all the titles that they absolutely deserve to have, and can they work together as a lineup? And like I said, this is one of the rosters that I wasn't a fan of. I thought Arguents were going to get the best of them. I thought they were going to really kind of ruin the team. I didn't think the chemistry was going to work with this roster because on paper, right, you look at the accomplishments, oh yeah, these guys are going to perform well together. But when it comes down to being on previous teams and then being together, it's a totally different story. But you talk about the issue of maybe having too many leaders, right? Nameless, known as a vocal player. Aches, known as a vocal player. Enable, known as a vocal player. I think we're starting to realize a little bit of a pattern going here. But the previous accomplishments that this team has had, individually and of course now combined, was really insane. You look at EG together, 30-plus major titles. That's absolutely absurd. 30-plus major championships on this team combined, along with 2 world championships and 2 second-place finishes at champs as well. Just absolutely, a phenomenal little stat line that you have there to really kind of compliment yourselves as a roster. But when we look at their actual placements, as far as how they did in-game, it didn't equate to what a lot of the community, and I'm sure Evil Geniuses themselves, thought of, right? CWL Dallas, starting off top 20 placement. They don't make it through pools, and they're knocked out by Mind Freak in a Game 5. You go later to CWL NOLA, top 8 finish, a little bit better. However, they lose in winners round 1 to United in another Game 5, and are later knocked out by Rise Nation 3-0. Later tournament, CWL Atlanta, also a top 8 finish. They don't make it through pools, and they get knocked out by United in a Game 5. Looking on here to CWL Birmingham, another top 20 placement where they don't make it through pools, and they're knocked out by Lightning Pandas 3-1. As far as the regular Pro League Stage 1 is considered, they end up having a top 14 placement, and that's out of 16 teams in total. They finish 7th in Division B, and they get relegated and aren't able to make it into playoffs. So you kind of started to see a little bit of a pattern kind of developing there from time to time, whether it were, the slow start, the medium beginning, and then the slow end, just really kind of sets the tone for what was this roster. Started off a little bit shaky, and then, they had their moments from time to time. But kind of getting back to what I was discussing, it was that this team, when it originally formed, heading into World War II, was highlighted just as much as Luminosity Gaming, just as much as the top teams that were getting developed and getting a lot of hype around themselves. EG, they were just literally right there alongside LG. And like I said, EG, I think the organization was incredibly hyped about this team. They gave them the Xfinity training facility where they're able to obviously hone their skills, try to play together, a little bit of a team house development. They had the Up to Speed documentary series, literally tracking every one of their moves. I mean, they were really building this up to be, a top team. Like, based on how Evil Geniuses was treating them, they were treating them to be a top 3 team. And I think they had the intentions of this roster being a top 3 roster in the world. Of course, that doesn't occur, and it was a very shaky start to their World War II. I mean, even after Dallas, I remember the very first series, I'm not sure if anyone else remembers this, the very first series of Call of Duty World War II on LAN was at Dallas, and it was a Map 1 Hardpoint versus E United. St. Marie and EG ends up getting taken down at 250 to 41. A 50-point club in their very first match as a roster versus United. And ever since then, right, ever since their first loss, ever since their top 20 placement at Dallas, it was always looming that something needs to be done with EG since the slow start, because they never really got the engine going. There was never really a moment where it was like, that's the EG that we know, that's the EG that's possible. It never really performed from them. But you have to hand it to the guys really for sticking it out. They kind of let this roster run its course and really gave it the necessary time that I think that it not just needed, but it deserved, right? They gave the necessary time for this roster, if it were going to perform at its highest peak. And of course, it never really saw anything higher than a top 8 placement. But of course, aside from the roster changes, they lose Enable, they release Nameless as well, and they bring in Silly and Assault. So let's go and talk about the new additions to this team. One thing that I immediately noticed, and I'm sure the community notices as well, is the prior history between Assault and Aches. Everyone remembers the Cloud9 roster from CDBL Champs 2016 that knocked down Optic Gaming in a Game 5. The level that really was just so hype around that roster. The kind of bad boys of the Call of Duty community for that tournament specifically. Later go on to finish top 6, as a team. But not many remember after that tournament that Aches and Assault actually stick together under Cloud9 for almost a year after. They play under Cloud9 through all of Infinite Warfare, and not just at the Black Ops 3 Champs, but it was almost an entire year, right, that they play with one another heading into the next Champs as well. So they have a ton of chemistry with one another. They've played with one another through multiple titles as well, so immediately you have that kind of granted chemistry. But one thing that's nice about Silly and Assault that you get if you're Evil Geniuses is that both come from teams that did not complement their play style. They come from rosters that didn't really give them the opportunity to shine, essentially. So if you're Evil Geniuses, it's like, hey, we might have found like diamonds in the rough when it comes down to these two pickups. You have Silly, right, role changed constantly. From Evil Geniuses, or from United, now in Evil Geniuses, from being the main assault rifle, then to being the flex, then to being the SMG alongside Persini. I mean, this guy, you have to give him a lot of credit and Silly, right? Because his role was consistently changing from tournament to tournament to tournament, and he still was having pretty consistent overall results. Same thing with Assault, right? Once Aqua is added, then he has to deal with the same type of player as him now in the lineup. Of course, both being known as main assault rifle players, but they do play at different paces. So while they are playing the same role, they play at much different speeds. Aqua, a very fast AR, and Assault being more of a slow. But let's go and talk about essentially Assault, right? Because both players not happy in their current position as a team. How did Assault necessarily kind of deal, with this prior lineup? Overall average after 5 events, I went through, wanted to average his entire kind of stats so far throughout the game. So after 5 events, not including Stage 1 playoffs, why? Because Echo Fox did not qualify for that. His overall average after 5 events, Hardpoint 106, Search and Destroy a 1.14, and CTF a 1.15. And if you get rid of CDBL Atlanta, which was statistically his worst event as a player, CDBL Atlanta, so let's say we get rid of that. In Hardpoint, he has a 1.09, Search and Destroy a 1.13, and CTF a 1.19. There's not a whole lot that gets affected after just one tournament. I mean, I think he still has a pretty solid performance in Search and Destroy and still plays pretty well when it comes to the CTF. There's not much of an upgrade that you get there. There's a 0.03 difference in Hardpoint. There's a 0.1, or not even much of a difference in the Search and Destroy, and a 0.04 difference between his overall average and his worst tournament average. I mean, there really isn't too much to be looking at, and he just screams consistency, and he's coming from a team who had no consistency. You talk about Echo Fox, their ability as a lineup. The major problem with this team is that they would take down the Titans, but then they lose to lesser known squads. I mean, there were times where I was even talking with a few analysts and whatnot. We were kind of breaking down and saying, okay, how does Echo Fox beat Splice, but then they lose to Lightning Pandas? It's like, that doesn't really make sense. And of course, Lightning Pandas at the time were a good team, but they were by no means a roster that could compare to Splice. And it was just like, how are they doing this well? But then they're also like, they were reaching their peak and they were reaching their lowest point within just a matter of a few hours. And along with Assault's overall performance as a player, especially in Hardpoint too, I mean, he has a little bit lower stats when it comes to Hardpoint. He also averages a minute in the hill per game. So if you want to talk about a consistent player, maybe Echo Fox might have lost their one consistent piece as a lineup together in losing the man known as Adam Assault. But having a player who also succeeds at a Game 2 and in Game 3 really, to me, sets up the team to have layers. Having the ability to have, one guy who doesn't perform necessarily at the Game 1 hardpoint, so then you can kind of give your teammates an opportunity to shine, get their shots flowing. But whenever you perform in Search and Destroy and CTF, that's such a rarity to find in someone. So I think to have a guy who can really consistently perform at that Game 2 and Game 3 is only going to help Evil Geniuses for the long run. Like I said, when it comes to Echo Fox, though, they don't really have the best track record when it comes to assessing players, right? Coming into World War II, drop methods, now a top 3 AR in the game, if not one of the best ARs, top 2 if you really want to argue that, in the entire game. They drop gunless, now the best flex player in the entire game. So maybe it's falling along the path to where Assault joins this team and maybe he becomes a top 5 AR player in the entire game, if he's already not self-deemed that by the community in certain circumstances. But Now that we've kind of talked about Assault, I really want to talk about Silly's role on this team as well, because this is, to me, an SMG presence upgrade for Silly, because to me, it's going to be a lot easier for him to work with a guy like Apathy, where the tone is going to be a nice little refresher. He's coming from a team who has been rumored to drop players for the last few months. The negativity that came from Clayster and the tweets suggesting a change that could happen at any moment. And you kind of set yourself away from that, living with the suspense for being with an organization since the very beginning, because Silly was the one main piece that started off this roster where he picks up the Twins, and it was drama at the time he was on the lineup. He was the first guy who had been on United since the very first event in Infinite Warfare. He was there since the very beginning, and now he can kind of relax, get that pressure off his shoulders, and really start off anew. And I think it's only going to help him as a player really kind of progress themselves. Of course, both Pristini and Apathy are known for being inconsistent in their play, but I think this kind of SMG role now for Apathy is only going to put more pressure on him as a player. And I think whenever he's at his best, it's when the pressure is on his shoulders in a certain role to where he knows if he doesn't perform, the roster's really going to struggle. So I think that is a little bit of a worrisome moment for Evil Geniuses, but at the same time, this is Apathy in one of his best forms, is with the pressure on him like this. So, personally, I really like the additions that EG make. I think they get rid of the issue with too many vocal leaders. They now have one solid kind of in-game leader in Aches now, with guys who can add feedback. They have solid AR players in both Aches and Assault who already have the chemistry, stretching back, Infinite Warfare, Black Ops 3 days as well. The big thing for me, though, is going to be the SMGs. How do they stack up? How do they work together? It might be a little bit of an issue off the break for Apathy and Silly, but I think as far as guys who have, as far as them as guys, as far as them as, kind of players out of game, I think they're going to work pretty well together. There's not one of them that's we're like, okay, you don't really have too much vocal leadership besides Aches on this team, which I think is really going to help out a lot of different aspects. You also have Aches, who's been probably one of the best players for Evil Geniuses, at least as of recently, compared to the last roster. Apathy, when we know, right, when Apathy's playing his game, man, he can absolutely take over a match, take over a series, take over a tournament. And I don't remember what tournament it was, but I remember looking back at stats and saying, remembering that Evil Geniuses was having a really slow start. They ended up having a pretty poor performance, but Apathy was like leading in Hardpoint. He was leading in Search and Destroy. He was like top 5 in CTF. I mean, he was just having an overall amazing tournament. So I think when it comes to Evil Geniuses, I like the pickups. On paper, it might not look too solid, but as far as stats are considered, as far as chemistry is considered, I think this is a nice refresher for the organization as a whole. And I think this team could really have some solid potential, in their future.